Dr. Doug Reed, Rural Silvicultural Program Lead at OMNRF at the Center for Northern Forest Ecosystem Research here in Thunder Bay. PhD in Forest Biology and Management from the University of Alberta in 2004. And as many of you in this room did, he started out tree planting in northern Alberta. That experience inspired him to obtain a BSc from the University of Alberta, and then he worked in industry for a while, and his work in Ontario has included ongoing research examining the effects and effectiveness of commercial thinning in black spruce plantations, the potential for managing jack pine and black spruce as conifer mixedwoods, and the relationship between silviculture and critical habitat elements for woodland caribou. Since 2014, Doug has served as the director of the Northwestern Ontario section of the Canadian Institute of Forestry. So Dr. Doug, she's all yours.
Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge with gratitude that we are on the traditional territory of the Fort William First Nation, and this work was possible because of the cooperation and treaties that exist between Canada and the Fort William First Nation and the Moose Cree in the Gordon Cousin Forest. So today I'm going to talk to you about accuracy of eFRI, ecosite, and species composition, or can we do things with imagery that we used to do on the ground? We were very fortunate to be able to access this funding through the Forestry Futures Trust, and they're a great organization that has the ability to be flexible because we were fortunate to overestimate our costs of the first phase of the project, and there was money that we hadn't used, and they allowed us to take some of that money and use it to do a second project which I'll only speak a little bit about at the end, but that was looking at the large-scale photography as an approach to assess regeneration. So our partners in this are the Forestry Futures Trust, the Gordon Cousins Forest, where we worked with Don Baisley and Kevin DeJuldis, and at the Lakehead Forest, where we worked with Greenmantle, Dave McIsaac, and Gene McIsaac. I don't think anyone from either of those places is here. Oh, we've got one from Tembec. Oh, Dave, you came. So it was really great working with those guys. I didn't see you here yesterday, Dave. Otherwise, I would have asked you about getting my tires changed again. At CINFRA, I have a great team to work with. This project was a little bit challenging because I went through some staffing changes over the course of the project. But Matthew Levesque, Emery Leeson, Brooke Davidson, Alex Hughes, Chris Stratton, Derek Papineau, and Jevin Haggins all worked with me on this project and did great work. So the purpose was to evaluate sort of a practical purpose. Can we get more practical use out of the fantastic inventory imagery, basically? Can we learn more that will inform harvesting operations, i.e. look at boundaries, areas that are perhaps not worth going into? Species distribution and age is always an important information for logging contractors and operators. And also, could we look at some of the site limitations and inform the silviculture planning, understand something more about Ecosite, how accurate is, we know that the inventory sometimes has limitations around soils and Ecosite. Kara's presentation inspired me yesterday that I think maybe we have some opportunity to work together on some of these things with that approach. So what we did was we thought, okay, if we take these proposed harvest areas that were identified by forest managers, and we took the eFRI imagery and had a trained interpreter look more closely at those specific areas, would we be able to improve the accuracy of the eFRI information? And could we tease out factors that are related to accuracy to inform future interpreters And can we gain additional site information that's not part of the inventory that might also be useful to the forest managers? So specifically, we're looking at things like slope, aspect, and understory regeneration. So the first phase, we had a proposed harvest blocks re-examined by a certified interpreter. We worked with Lorna Pitt at Forest Tech Consulting. She's a very professional and experienced interpreter. She's worked in a lot of different forests, and so we felt we had a good opportunity to have a consistent interpretation across all the areas that we looked at. So we took the sort of interpreter bias potential out of it, or we just accepted that Lorna has a certain amount of interpreter bias and we'll live with that. We had her populate a generic eFRI attribute table plus these additional variables that we were looking for. And we asked her to document the time that it would take to do this, because we know that if we want to go out in the field and do an SP or a silvicultural prescription, that's going to take a significant amount of time. How much time would it take to do it this way? So once Lorna had gone through and interpreted a number of stands, we went out and, as much as we could, surveyed on the ground each of the strata that she delineated. So on here, this is the imagery, and the yellow points are our plots, our prism sweeps. The red points are where we did an ecosite. We also did tree heights, basal area, fixed area plots in the understory looking at regeneration that was less than 10 centimeters in diameter. And we did those fixed area plots in all the plots, and we did the basal area sweeps in all the plots, but we did the additional information in the intensive plots. These two forests that we were working with were kind of different. The Lakehead Forest those harvest areas were identified within a forest management plan that was developed using a previous inventory. And so they had different polygons to work with in designing their cut blocks from the beginning, whereas Tembec had used one of the earliest versions of the eFRI imagery and derived inventory. Access and harvest scheduling, one of the first blocks we went to when we got there, one of the within stand polygons had already been harvested because the Lakehead Forest has a number of different logging contractors operating on it. They tend to operate around the year because the soils and access allows that sort of thing. Whereas in the Gordon Cousins Forest, access is limited. And most of the harvesting happens in the winter months with frozen ground conditions. A couple of the blocks we had to access by boat. Lorna was able to interpret 30 harvest blocks that were identified in each of the two forests. We heard a little bit about this from Jordy yesterday. I do want to say regarding my question that I asked yesterday about the workshop that happened in Sault Ste. Marie. The point of my question, and really the frustration that I have, is that even though good ideas come forward, oftentimes we're hamstrung by the system that we work within, where one change in the inventory, which everything relies on, would have a cascading effect because there's not the flexibility within our system. And really, it would be nice if we had effectiveness monitoring of our large policy framework that we all have to live within. In any case, back to the presentation. We had incomplete coverage of one block in Gordon Cousins, so we actually only got 29 interpreted blocks. And we had Lorna interpret more blocks than we thought we could get to, because what we wanted to do was get field data in stands that actually got harvested. We know in Ontario that we're not harvesting our full profile, and so we wanted to make sure that as much as possible we were doing this field work and interpretation in areas that were going to be harvested, so that we could look at the regeneration and look at whether this information that we've collected has helped in any way, shape, or form, and also start to build a database of sites where we know what the pre-harvest condition was. We have good information on pre-harvest condition. We can look at silvicultural practices and look at the long-term result, but that will come later. Don't worry, I'll send in the proposal to the Forestry Futures Trust Committee. This is fairly typical of what we saw in the interpretations. You can see over here, there's one calibration strip cruise. Lorna had the calibration strip cruises to work with, but rarely were there calibration strips within the blocks that she was interpreting. And you can get some information from something this close, but if it doesn't look just like this, then you're looking further away, and but we'll see what the results look like. In the Lakehead Forest, before she even got started, Lorna was noticing some things. So these are polygons where, under the original eFRI, there's an you see the old line work there from the old eFRI, and right away, you could see that, well, there's potentially more harvestable area in this block, and then you have a block that looks like this, where this outer line here defined the planned harvest area, but something had happened in here. I think we found out later that there'd been something with an adjacent landowner overachieving his opportunity, and so we, Lorna was able to do things like this. So essentially, she started with what inventory information what there was available, overlaid that on top of the eFRI imagery, and then deleted all the line work before she started doing her interpretations. So this was where she would be at the start of interpretation. There is a light gray line there that's hard to see. After she took the line work out, areas that were not operational for harvest were identified, and ages, Lorna did not interpret ages. The ages that she used were what was available in the inventory that she had to work with. We talked with our partners before we started the project and wanted to know what were the things that they were hoping to get out of this project. In the Gordon Cousins Forest, they've made a commitment to try to reduce the amount of herbicide that they're using in their forest operations. And so they were looking for subtle changes in slope and elevation that are associated with aspen regeneration. So where you have relatively low relief topography, a little bit of elevation gain dries things out, and the aspen can really come back after harvest. Whereas if it's very flat and a little bit more of a lowland condition, you don't have to really worry about it. In the Lakehead Forest, it was a different objective, different question. The foresters there felt that where they had a good regeneration of balsam fir in the understory, that was a sign that there was a good opportunity for conifer regeneration, and where they would invest in the types of silvicultural treatments that are required to get a spruce or other conifer forest regeneration. So we went out and did our field work. We saw a lot of this in the Gordon Cousins Forest, as you would expect. The bugs were bad. In the Lakehead Forest, we saw some more variable stuff. So in the Gordon Cousins Forest, remember the project partner we were working with selected stands that were conifer dominated for the most part, and they were looking for how much aspen, how much relief is in those stands where we're going to expect to see some aspen coming back that we're going to have to deal with. In the Lakehead Forest, they were looking more at stands that were classified as mixed woods in the inventory, and trying to see if we could get what the potential was for conifer regeneration, because they could go, after harvest, they could go deciduous or they could stay conifer. So we saw a little bit more variability. This is Jevin. There's Matt getting some ages. There's Chris doing a soil pit. That's me with the auger. If I'd have known, I could have had Chris do part of this presentation. Maybe next time. So we did 15 stands in the Gordon Cousin Forest. We were able to survey 13 stands in the Lakehead Forest. The average number of strata per block was higher in the Gordon Cousins Forest, but it was more variable in the Lakehead Forest. So we had as many as 10 different strata identified within an individual harvest area in a stand in the Lakehead Forest, and as few as 2. Had some interesting experiences along the way as well. I was able to get out in the field a few times, and one of the times was in this stand where we walked all the way up this beautiful jack pine dominated forest unit, and having come off recently been working with caribou and seeing various signs of caribou, walking along and I'm like, what is this? This looks like caribou scat. I got very excited. We're just on the border with the United States. This is North Fowl Lake here. Doesn't seem like there should be any caribou there. Well, there aren't. It's actually white-tailed deer. But, I was excited for a few minutes, a few days. So getting into the results, in the Lakehead Forest, the fact that we had this harvest areas designed with an old inventory and new inventory to look at, Lorna was able to identify some areas to pull out of those proposed harvest blocks so that, reduce the amount of area. New natural, there was some large areas. This one stand where she identified 40 hectares of new natural, she didn't pull it out because it was sort of, there was too much of it to pull out of the harvest area, but we were able to identify that. Or she was able to identify that. But for the most part, a few things were identified. In the Gordon Cousins Forest, where the harvest areas had been designed using the imagery-derived inventory, we didn't get these kinds of reductions in harvest area. In terms of how much time it took Lorna, on average in the Gordon Cousins Forest, she took about 2 hours to look at each polygon, each proposed harvest unit. The largest was close to 3 hours and the minimum was 1 hour, and basically the bigger blocks took longer, as you would expect if you're working with imagery and you have more area to look at. In the Lakehead Forest, the time it took was a little bit longer. Average was closer to 3 hours. One stand took 6 hours and 12 minutes, and one stand took only 45 minutes. So here's that same block. This is what actually ended up being interpreted as the potential harvest polygon, and there you can see the internal. So each of these polygons would be a different ecosite. In the Lakehead, we saw decreases that averaged around 3 hectares. The maximum was 19.5 or 19.6. 11 blocks where the proposed harvest boundary was reduced. There were 19 blocks where the proposed harvest area actually increased by a small amount, on average about 1.7 hectares. The maximum was 4.3. In the Gordon Cousins Forest, we saw 17 blocks where there was a slight decrease in the harvest area, and 12 blocks where there was a slight increase, but these were very minor amounts of change. We also asked our interpreter to record the scale that she was interpreting things at. The overall harvest area was interpreted at a scale closer to, what's the number on there? 60,000, 1 to 60,000, so at a very low scale. But getting into this stuff, you can see that a lot of the attributes are being interpreted between 1,500 and 2,000, 1 to 1,500 and 1 to 2,000. But height, you're getting right in there, because with height, they're actually measuring the height of the tree using the imagery. It's important to point out that we did not have the digital terrain model that we were talking about yesterday to do this work. So the height measurements that Lorna was making were identifying the top of a tree and identifying a point on the ground as close to that tree as she could to get an estimate of height. So in this previous slide, these attributes were interpreted in almost all of the 156 polygons within the cut blocks that were assessed, proposed cut blocks that were assessed. These were less frequently interpreted, but incidental species, you've got to get down into the 1 to 1,000 scale, or that's what Lorna was getting down to try to see these incidental species that we're interested in. So in general, some of the trends that we saw, the interpreter identified a greater number of ecosites or polygons within the harvest block, so finer delineation, less lumping. There was better identification of the locations of drainages and transitions, but more species per polygon were typically identified, and some tended to be called more frequently, others less so. So in this example, these are the values based on the original inventory that was proposed. This is from the Gordon Cousins Forest. So trembling aspen, black spruce, white birch, and balsam poplar in this polygon that goes around here. And Lorna's interpretations subdivided that from 3 different polygons into 4 different polygons. She was able to interpret that balsam poplar was more predominant in that area than the trembling aspen. We see species like balsam fir getting identified more frequently than in the original inventory. So we sort of did a qualitative assessment of, did Lorna change the polygon shape, and did she change the polygon boundaries? Because a lot of times the new interpretation was very similar to the old interpretation, but in other cases it was quite different. So in the Gordon Cousins Forest, about half the time, 46% of the time, she changed the shape. But in the Lakehead, it was much higher. And I think that's largely because the polygons were from an older inventory. And the boundaries changed about half the time overall. So the big question is, what about accuracy? And leading species. How we were doing leading species and how an interpreter does leading species is they look at the polygon as a whole and they try to identify the canopy tree, the tree that is most common in the canopy. And so we did that kind of the same way on the ground. We had our professional foresters and our trained technicians. When they were doing the survey, they would visit a few of the plot locations to begin with. They would make a decision at that point after they'd visited 3 or 4 of them. I think this is probably the best place for us to do our Ecosite of the 10 plot locations that we have. And then when they got to that plot location, that was when they would decide what the leading species was based on what they were seeing on the ground. So they're looking up all the time, trying to see what's the dominant canopy tree in this stand. And we didn't always agree. But we also did leading species based on basal area. So we took the basal area from all of our prism sweeps, and that actually tended to agree more with what Lorna was interpreting than our gut feel on the ground. Our species composition helps to determine standard forest unit. Those numbers that agree were not great. Ecosite, 24% of the time, the ecosite was identical. So what Lorna interpreted was the same thing that our crews determined on the ground. The ecosites that we got right the most are poplar birch on coarse loamy and poplar birch on fine loamy. And the ones that we got wrong the most are poplar birch on clay and pine spruce on moist fine textures. What our staff were telling us was that it's the soil moisture, it's the soil texture. That's what's changing the ecosite a lot of the time. Sometimes it was species comp, but a lot of the time it was the moisture regime and the soil texture that determined that moisture regime that resulted in a difference in ecosite. In terms of soil texture, the one we got the most was fresh coarse loamy. The ones that were most often misidentified were fresh clay, fresh fine loamy, and moist fine loamy. But there were errors and correct calls across all of the different soil textures and ecosites. In terms of age, we're looking at age that we measured in the field at breast height. We also tried to do total age, but we used our breast height age as the comparison because a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with hardwood dominated stands, those stump ages are impossible to record because of rot. Overall, the inventories, the two inventories that we were working with, estimated age to be older than what we recorded in the field. But there was variability. Some blocks were good, some blocks were not so good. This is from the Lakehead Forest. And you can see between the different strata, sometimes there was a lot of variability between strata, but other times they were fairly tight and fairly accurate. So we can get it right, we just don't always. In terms of height, overall, across both of the two forests, the interpreted heights are a bit shorter by about 1 meter than the field measured heights. So in the Gordon Cousins Forest, we had, I thought, pretty good agreement. In the Lakehead Forest, we had some where there was really dramatic differences in height. And I need to do more work to figure out what's associated with those differences. Average stalking. Surprisingly, despite this variability across the two management units, there was no statistical difference in overall stalking call. But, I mean, you have a number between 60 and 100 generally. In the Lakehead Forest, there was more variability, and we did have, stalking greater than 1 based on our field measurements in one block. But generally, it was actually pretty good, and that's kind of surprising since we had differences in species and differences in height, but we got the same stalking. Site class. Generally speaking, because we got these taller trees in the field, or the heights that we measured in the field were taller and the ages were younger, we tended to have higher site class. So we may be underestimating the productivity of our forest, and I think, again, digital terrain model. If we have a good digital terrain model, our height estimates will get better. We can automate that a lot more effectively and efficiently with the right tools. But in 2 cases, our field measured site class was actually lower in the Gordon Cousins Forest. In the Lakehead Forest, it was pretty consistent that our site class estimates based on our field measurements were higher than in the interpretations. In terms of the added attributes, 102 times, whether in her comments or in the understory call within the eFRI attribute table, I think only 5 times Lorna was actually able to call an understory consistent with the guidelines of the eFRI. But she provided comments on every block and tried to zoom in and see if she could see species. So 102 times she was able to say something like, oh, I think I see balsam fir regeneration in the understory, or I see aspen regeneration in the understory. So those were the two most commonly identified, but she did see some others. In the field, we found understory species in almost every stand. So our understory is something that it's hard to pick up in the inventory because you're looking at leaf-on conditions, you're seeing the canopy, and if that's a good, healthy canopy, you're not going to see what's underneath it. We had good agreement in terms of slope and aspect. It's very difficult to interpret, particularly in flat terrain, but we had good agreement in the lakehead forest where things are more variable and where you have like a slope of 5 or 6%. It's pretty consistent with what Lorna could see in the imagery. So conclusions from that is that we can obtain additional information through interpretation at a finer scale. This is particularly useful where maybe you're working with an old inventory and designing your cut blocks, or you've had to work with an old inventory to design your cut blocks and you want to look at something new. Wet areas and operational reductions might be worth having a look at. And you can get a better picture of species composition, although that is, there are some errors there. Field information is also useful. I think the conifer understory information that Lorna was able to pull out was useful to the operator. In the Gordon Cousins Forest, when we met with them and presented our results, they were really excited when we were able to point out, oh, in this polygon we actually found some coarse loamy or some sand, because there's not very much of that there and they want to use that if they're building roads. We also learned that more about how they use LiDAR on an ongoing basis, which is really interesting. The species information is useful. One of the things that Jeannie told us was if you can identify where conchs are on the aspen, then I have an idea that that probably means the aspen regeneration is not going to be as robust, and I might make a decision to go to conifer regeneration in those stands. But you can't pick that up off the inventory. You got to be on the ground to see those things. So that's all I had to say about the eFRI. We're still working on the report and getting that out in a sort of more formal sense. This last summer, we were able to take a good portion of the money from this project and use it to support our staffing. And we did a really interesting project looking at large-scale photography that was collected in the fall of 2016 during leaf-off conditions. And the objective of this was for Resolute to conduct their silviculture effectiveness monitoring that's mandated under their forest management plan. We spent the last 2 weeks really trying to get that data together. We've discovered there are some data cleaning issues and data management issues that we need to work on before we make, grand sweeping proclamations about its effectiveness. But I will say that based on what I've seen and looked at, that I think the juvenile stocking, where you take a 16 square meter plot and you say I've got 4 quadrants within that plot, how many of those quadrants are occupied by an acceptable or target species? I think that the large-scale photography that we looked at, that was collected at 10 centimeter resolution, did a pretty good job of that. I think it's reasonably accurate. In terms of species composition, the results at this point are a little bit mixed. We need to look at the differences in height, because if you have a regen standard that says any deciduous tree over 2 meters tall counts, but you've got conifer trees that are 3 or 4 meters tall, does a 2.5 meter tall birch matter? Does it amount to the same thing? So we have to look at that data, and we have data there that we can look at and try to inform what we're seeing in those results. What we had hoped to do with this project was also to get out and look at some heights of older trees that would meet what's being talked about as the performance assessment. What we need in the performance assessment is we need a good estimate of height and breast height age. So if we have a juvenile assessment, we should have a good idea of what breast height age is. And then if we can use imagery, we can do the performance assessment at a fairly low cost. But unless we have a digital terrain model that tells us where the ground is with reasonable precision and accuracy, we're not going to be able to do that. And we're going to be spending money to send people out in the field to measure tree heights. That's all I have. Any questions? Got two back there.
Thanks, Doug, for interesting presentation. I had a couple of concerns when I saw the discrepancy between your one interpreter to the vendor interpreted polygons and the fact that your accuracies were all less than chance. Knowing what you know right now, if you did this again, would you not use more interpreters? That is my main concern with this, that you're using one interpreter basing all your accuracies against vendor records. And so I'm just really puzzled why you used one interpreter.
We used one interpreter for budgetary reasons. That we anticipated that the field costs were going to be the majority of the costs, and it ended up being, we have fantastic field crews that are more efficient than I thought they would be. Yeah, I think if knowing what I know now, maybe the question would be equally valid. Can 7 different interpreters come up with the same answer for the same piece of ground? Yeah.
Yeah, Doug, I was just wondering, did you consider this, or did you see any instances where there was a vintage issue here, where the imagery is collected 8 years ago and you were in the field now, so that it wasn't apples to apples, that your interpreter was looking at imagery, and when you went to the field, that stand condition didn't exist, that in the intervening 8 years there had been breakup, decline, ice damage, storms, those kinds of things, so that it wasn't an apples to apples comparison in that kind of sense? Did you see that happening at all, or consider that?
I think that's possible, but there was nothing that jumped out at us at the time. We definitely noticed that, the interpretations in the Lakehead Forest were much better, much more consistent with what we were seeing in the field than when we looked at the old inventory. But I mean, that inventory was developed from black and white photos that were taken in the late 90s. So there obviously should have been a significant amount of change since then. We were looking at imagery that was maybe 4 or 5 years old.
Hi, Doug.
Hi.
I'm a foreigner here from British Columbia. I'm from Victoria. We carried out a study with multiple interpreters, and I have searched far and wide to find any study anywhere that has done this kind of work. Also, what we did is we did it all at the plot scale to make sure that it was consistent with the ground data. So on the species recognition thing, photo interpreters did pretty well if there was one species in the plot. And this has been documented actually also in one study. Sorry, I can't figure it out, but I'll send this stuff to you. As the number of species goes up, the success goes down. So you start at 80 and you wind up at around 50 or 40 or something like that. The other thing that you find out is that interpreters agree more with the ground plots than they agree with themselves. So there's a lot of variability. On the age front, what I found was that interpreters rely much more heavily on height than they do on sight, which you would kind of expect because sight's a tougher one. So you see the correlation between age and height go way up versus something that was literally, I mean, you know, doing the increment cores, measuring the trees, calculating the site indices from the ground plot data. So yeah, I think the multiple, third thing, sorry. When we're looking at these data, the other thing that I originally did is I sort of did some regression analysis between, for example, photo interpreter's age versus measured age. Well, really they're both wrong. This is the case of regressing two y variables, one y variable and another y variable. And after thinking about it, I realized there's a number of different names for this, but the real way to go about this is using orthogonal regression techniques. It goes by a whole bunch of different names in the literature, but if you're interested in pursuing those kinds of things, I recommend you do that.
Yeah, we should talk. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Now,